Caleb Dawson had spent years convincing himself that a quiet life was enough. Ever since losing his wife, the old ranch had become a place where silence lingered longer than conversation, and memories echoed louder than laughter. He rose before dawn, tended his horses, repaired his fences, and returned each evening to an empty house that asked nothing of him. He had learned that peace often came from keeping his distance from other people's troubles. But the frightened young woman he had found beside a broken wagon on that lonely mountain road had already begun changing that, even if neither of them realized it yet. When he suggested she remain at the ranch until the wagon could be repaired, she hesitated, glancing nervously toward the road as though expecting someone to appear at any moment. Finally, she gave a reluctant nod. "Just for a day or two," she whispered. "Then I'll be gone." Caleb simply replied, "You'll leave when you're safe enough to leave." From the moment Eleanor stepped inside the ranch house, small things began changing. The kitchen, once used only for necessity, filled with the comforting smell of fresh bread and simmering stew. Torn shirts Caleb had intended to throw away mysteriously appeared neatly stitched and folded. Dusty books that had remained unopened since his wife's passing were stacked beside the fireplace, as though someone had been quietly reading them late into the night. Even an injured ranch dog that had refused food for days slowly began eating from Eleanor's gentle hand. She never spoke about herself, yet little details slipped through the cracks of her silence. She recognized the bloodline of Caleb's prize stallion with a single glance. She corrected the pronunciation of a French phrase printed in one of the old books without thinking. One rainy evening, Caleb returned from the barn to hear music drifting softly through the house. Eleanor sat alone at the neglected piano, her fingers moving across the faded keys with effortless grace. The melody was beautiful enough to make the entire room feel alive again. The moment she noticed him standing in the doorway, she stopped playing and quietly apologized, as if beauty itself required permission. Whenever unfamiliar riders passed along the road, however, that calm disappeared. Eleanor would step away from the windows, retreat into another room, and remain hidden until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. She never asked about the town. Never spoke of family. Never laughed the way someone her age should. She wasn't living. She was surviving. The more Caleb watched her, the more certain he became that she wasn't hiding from hardship. She was hiding from someone. A few days later, Sheriff Dawson stopped by the ranch while checking boundary fences. As they shared coffee on the porch, he casually mentioned that several wealthy men had ridden through Willow Creek searching for a missing young woman. "They're offering enough money to buy half the valley," the sheriff said with a low whistle. "Dead or alive?" Caleb's expression never changed, but his eyes drifted toward the house where Eleanor quietly washed dishes by the kitchen window. He said nothing. That night, long after the lamps had been extinguished, Caleb noticed the small leather satchel Eleanor always kept close had fallen open beside the guest room door. He bent down to close it without looking, but a folded newspaper slipped onto the floor. He froze. Across the front page was a carefully printed portrait of the very woman sleeping only a few feet away. Above her picture, in bold letters, were the words that stole the breath from his chest. "Governor's daughter missing after wedding night." The newspaper remained exactly where Caleb had found it. By sunrise, it was neatly folded back inside Eleanor's leather satchel, and when she joined him on the porch that morning, he greeted her no differently than he had the day before. He asked if she had slept well, handed her a warm cup of coffee, and spoke only about the day's work. The kindness caught her off guard. She searched his face for suspicion but found only quiet patience. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, the corners of her mouth lifted into the faintest smile. It disappeared almost as quickly as it came, but Caleb noticed. The days settled into an unexpected rhythm. Together they repaired weathered fences, gathered wandering cattle from the hills, and rode across wide stretches of prairie where the only sounds were the wind and distant birds. Eleanor gradually exchanged soft hands for work-worn ones, learning the steady rhythm of ranch life, while Caleb discovered that silence was not always the absence of words. Sometimes, it was the language of people who had survived more than they could bear to speak about. Meanwhile, Willow Creek buzzed with rumors. Armed bounty hunters rode from business to business carrying a portrait of a missing woman and promising a fortune in gold for information. Curious townspeople whispered her description over supper tables and outside the general store. Caleb quietly made certain Eleanor stayed out of sight whenever strangers approached the ranch. He wasn't protecting her because he knew who she was. He was protecting her because fear as deep as hers could never be an act. One cool evening, as flames crackled gently inside the fireplace, Eleanor broke the silence. If someone powerful wanted to take everything from you. She stared into the fire before finishing. Would you fight? Caleb didn't answer immediately. Depends, he finally said. On what they're trying to take. She lowered her eyes. My life. The words hung between them like smoke. Gathering his courage, Caleb asked the question he had been carrying for days. Who are you, Eleanor? She opened her mouth to answer. Instead, tears spilled down her cheeks. Quiet, uncontrollable tears, the first she'd allowed herself since the day he found her beside that broken wagon. She never spoke. The following morning, Caleb stepped into the barn and stopped cold. Nailed to the weathered wooden door was a fresh reward poster bearing Eleanor's portrait. The amount offered had doubled. That evening, as rain tapped softly against the ranch house windows, Eleanor finally found the courage to tell the story she had spent months running from. Her voice trembled as she admitted she was Eleanor Hart, the daughter of Governor Richard Hart. She had not disappeared by choice. Months earlier, she had been forced into an arranged marriage with the son of a wealthy railroad tycoon, a union built not on love but on politics, land, and power. On their wedding night, she discovered the man she had married was cruel, violent, and tied to several unexplained deaths. The moment she threatened to expose him, her own life became the price of his silence. No one believed her. Not even her father, who chose to protect his reputation instead of his daughter. With nowhere left to turn, she fled into the night carrying nothing but hope that somewhere, someone would believe her. Caleb listened without speaking, his eyes never leaving hers. When the room finally fell silent, he said quietly, "You weren't running from home." Eleanor slowly shook her head. No. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I was running to survive. In that moment, everything Caleb thought he knew changed. He realized she wasn't hiding because she was guilty. She was hiding because telling the truth had made her the hunted one. Without another word, he made his decision. No amount of gold would convince him to hand her over. But by the following afternoon, the choice was no longer his alone. Riders thundered into Willow Creek, clearing the dusty street as a polished black carriage rolled to a stop. Stepping out with quiet confidence, the railroad heir removed his gloves, looked toward the gathered crowd, and announced that he had come personally to take his wife home. By the next morning, the railroad heir had already begun winning people over. Dressed in expensive clothes and speaking with polished confidence, he walked the streets of Willow Creek shaking hands and thanking townsfolk for their concern. He described Eleanor as a troubled young woman overcome by grief, insisting she had become confused after the wedding and wandered away without understanding what she was doing. Then, with convincing sorrow in his voice, he made an even darker accusation. He claimed Caleb had taken advantage of her vulnerable state and was refusing to let her return home. To many in town, the story sounded believable. After all, he carried influence, wealth, and a respected family name. Caleb was only a rancher standing against one of the most powerful men in the state. But not everyone accepted the story so easily. Pastor Thomas had seen the terror in Eleanor's eyes the day she arrived at church seeking a quiet place to pray. Mrs. Ellis remembered how Eleanor instinctively flinched whenever an unfamiliar man's voice grew too loud. Neither reaction could be rehearsed. They were the scars of someone who had lived in fear for far too long. Without drawing attention to herself, Mrs. Ellis quietly opened the back room of her general store, giving Eleanor a safe place whenever strangers filled the streets. Sheriff Dawson, meanwhile, stopped accepting easy answers. Instead of relying on the railroad heir's polished words, he began asking difficult questions. Why had there never been an official search organized by the governor's office? Why were armed bounty hunters sent instead of deputies? Why did every servant who worked at the governor's estate suddenly refuse to speak? As he dug deeper, old rumors resurfaced. Former employees quietly admitted that the railroad heir had a violent temper. Travelers recalled hearing whispers about unexplained deaths connected to his business dealings. One frightened stable hand finally confessed he had witnessed Eleanor trying to flee the estate on the very night of her wedding. Little by little, the perfect image the railroad heir had carefully built began to crack. The man everyone had trusted suddenly became the man everyone questioned. Willow Creek found itself divided. Some believed money and reputation. Others believed the frightened young woman who had asked for nothing except the chance to live. For the first time, the powerful realized something they had never expected. Ordinary people, standing together, could refuse to be intimidated. That evening, as the last light faded across the ranch, Eleanor stood beside the fence watching the sunset. Without looking at Caleb, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "If I testify." She paused, fighting back tears. "They'll destroy everything you've built." The words settled heavily between them, because they both knew she wasn't just risking her own future anymore. She was risking his as well. That night, Caleb saddled his strongest horse before the sun had fully disappeared behind the western hills. He packed a saddlebag with enough money to last for months, food for the journey, and a map leading to a quiet border town where no one would know Eleanor's name. When he handed her the reins, his voice was calm, even though his heart was anything but. "You can leave tonight," he said. "Cross the border before sunrise. They'll never find you." Eleanor looked at the horse, then at the man who had risked everything to protect her. Slowly, she shook her head. "If I run now," she whispered, "he'll find another woman to silence." She wasn't choosing revenge. She was choosing to make sure no one else would ever have to live through what she had endured. The courthouse overflowed the following morning. Ranchers, merchants, pastors, and politicians filled every bench, waiting to hear whether the governor's daughter would finally speak. Eleanor walked inside with steady steps, though fear still rested behind her eyes. When she took the witness stand, the room fell silent enough to hear every breath. She told the truth. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Simply, honestly. She described the arranged marriage, the violence hidden behind wealth and influence, the threats, the deaths she had been warned never to mention, and the desperate escape that had brought her to a lonely mountain road. One witness after another stepped forward. Former servants, stable hands, and business associates confirmed what they had hidden for years. Piece by piece, the railroad heir's carefully crafted lies collapsed beneath the weight of the truth. Across the courtroom, Governor Richard Hart lowered his head. The pride that had once blinded him gave way to shame. Rising slowly from his seat, he faced his daughter with tears in his eyes. "I failed you," he said quietly. "And I am sorry." Eleanor listened without bitterness. Months earlier, those words would have meant everything. Now they simply brought peace. She no longer needed her father's approval to know her own worth. She had already found something far more precious, a place where someone believed her before ever asking her name. Outside the courthouse, as the crowd slowly drifted away, she turned to Caleb. "You were the first man who asked if I was safe." Her voice softened. "Instead of asking who I belonged to." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eleanor picked up the small travel bag she had carried since the day they met and started toward the waiting stagecoach. Caleb watched her take several steps before finally finding the courage to speak. "You don't have to leave." Months passed, and Willow Creek slowly became known for something far more valuable than wealth or influence. Eleanor stayed, not as the governor's daughter and not as the woman who had once fled for her life, but simply as Eleanor. She opened the town's first school for girls, filling a once-empty building with laughter, books, and dreams that had never before been given a place to grow. Caleb's ranch became a refuge where weary travelers were welcomed with a warm meal, an honest handshake, and the kindness that had first brought their lives together. The same townspeople who had once questioned Eleanor now stood beside her without hesitation, protecting her as though she had always been one of their own. One quiet afternoon, a young traveler paused outside the little schoolhouse and asked with innocent curiosity, "Is it true you're the governor's daughter?" Eleanor smiled gently before looking across the road, where Caleb was repairing a weathered fence beneath the golden afternoon sun. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Then she turned back to the young girl and answered softly, "Once. Now. I'm exactly where I belong." Caleb smiled without saying a word, and in that silent exchange they understood something neither of them needed to explain. Home had never been the mansion she escaped or the title she left behind. Home was the place where someone chose to believe her when the rest of the world refused. Sometimes the people we rescue are not stranded because they are weak. They are stranded because they have spent too long running from those who should have protected them. Caleb thought he had found nothing more than a frightened traveler beside a broken wagon. Instead, he found a woman courageous enough to risk everything for the truth. And by believing her before he ever knew her name, he discovered that the greatest acts of courage rarely begin with grand gestures. They begin with one simple decision: to stop, to listen, and to be kind when everyone else keeps riding past.